I'm going to talk to you about depression. But what is depression? I can tell you about it from my own experience. I was a full-time psychiatrist for over 30 years. But I've also been a teacher and researcher in primary care psychiatry. And I've also been a patient too. I've experienced depression on and off throughout my adult life. A lot of people say, well, it's just sadness, isn't it? It's just being unhappy. Well, no, it isn't. It's actually more than sadness. Depression is about feeling despair. It's persistent. Sometimes you even don't feel anything. You actually just feel numb. But mostly, people feel their mood is very low. They lose their interest and pleasure in life. And it also affects them in many different ways. It affects their body, it affects how they think, it affects how they feel, it affects the whole person. It's much more than having a few hours of feeling unhappy. Not feeling hungry, not wanting to eat, losing weight, not sleeping. So depression isn't just a list of symptoms. It's not a single thing. There isn't even a single cause for it. So how can we understand it? Well, what I've learned is the best way to understand depression is to think about the balance between what makes us vulnerable and the stresses that can trigger it off. But if you look it up in the books, you'll find it just says, and at least 4 of the following: change in sleep, change in appetite, loss of energy or motivation, poor concentration, guilt, self-reproach, being slowed up or being agitated, and hopelessness and suicidal thoughts. But it's more than that. There are many more symptoms than that. That is just what was found 30 years ago to be a useful shorthand for helping us consistently diagnose depression. And certainly, for me, it's not the symptoms, but the stories that are important. People have stories about what's happened to them in life. And it's about the stories of how they became so low. They may feel very afraid. Anxiety commonly coexists in depression. They may have lost something or someone who's really important to them. They may be preoccupied with past traumas and events. They may just feel that they need to be loved. They may never have had anyone who they felt cared about them. They may feel very lonely. They may have difficulty in trusting others. They may have failed to grieve. I had problems early in life as a teenager with terrible anxiety about examinations, and that carried on when I went to medical school. Quite extreme anxiety at times. And I got very depressed. And I first saw a psychiatrist when I was in my early 20s. I've had treatment for depression on and off since then. The episodes have often been triggered by difficulties at work. One episode, though, was very much triggered by my father dying and me not coming to terms with his death, and another by the loss of a relationship that was very important to me. So loss features very strongly in my story of depression. But I've also survived, and I've had treatment. We know that the lifetime risk of depression is about 15 to 18%, meaning it's common. About 1 in 5 of us has it at some point in our lives. As I said, people commonly have anxiety too, and it's twice as common in women. There's 2 kinds of depression. There's unipolar, where you have a single episode or recurrent, like I have, Sometimes that can become very severe and you can lose touch with reality. You can have delusions, start to believe things that don't have any basis in the real world. Perhaps believe that you're suffering from some terrible illness, or that you've caused something awful to happen in the world, like a tsunami or an explosion. You may have hallucinations where you start to hear voices telling you terrible things, that you're a waste of time, that you're useless, even telling you to harm yourself. The kind of experiences that people have with depression are usually very depressing in themselves. But there's also bipolar disorder, where people both get depressed, but also get manic or hypermanic too. And by mania, I mean that rather than being depressed, you're the opposite. You've actually got too much energy. You actually start to speed around, not sleep at all, wanting to do everything, staying up all night, have lots of energy, want to do everything at once, want to create everything, get very, very annoyed when people won't let you do what you want to do. It's much less common, and treatment is different. But I've certainly treated many people who have bipolar disorder, which is not the same as just having depression. What things make us more vulnerable? Well, our early life experiences are very important. If things happen to us early in life that are very stressful, that affects us longer term. Being separated from our mothers, being neglected, having to live through conflict and abuse, emotional, physical and sexual abuse. There's even evidence that these early experiences may have a biological impact on our brains. We also know now that inflammatory mechanisms may play a part in the onset and continuation of depression. You hear a lot about the serotonin theory of depression, and there's certainly evidence now that it's not as straightforward as we once thought it was. We thought that it was to do with deficiency of neurotransmitters, the messengers, the chemical messengers that help transmit information between neurons in the brain. And the way antidepressants worked was initially believed to actually increase the presence of those neurotransmitters. But it's not as simple as that. And in any case, it takes 3 weeks for them to work. So it isn't a matter of simply increasing the presence of serotonin. Genes play a part. First-degree relatives of patients with major depression have a threefold risk of developing it. But what's important is the gene-environment interaction. If things are going on in our lives that are stressful, that may, I think, activate genes. So it's not just about having the genes, it's about what's going on in your life as well. Physical causes are important. Alcohol and drugs both can depress you. Physical illness, having an underactive thyroid, having chronic illnesses like diabetes and heart disease. I'll mention a patient called Francis here, who was a man in his 50s, a businessman who had a heart attack. And afterwards, he started to feel depressed and felt that he just couldn't look after his family anymore. He wasn't going to be able to work again. He was actually afraid of moving around in case he had more chest pain. And he started to not take care of himself. And it was really worrying because he wasn't going along to the cardiac rehabilitation, to the exercises that he needed to do. And this isn't that unusual. Quite a number of people get depression after having had a heart attack. And as we get older, we get more prone. The aging brain is actually more vulnerable to getting depressed. Psychotherapists would say that past relationships are even more important in terms of the impact they have on how we feel about ourselves. When you've had those losses, abusive relationships and harm in your life, it makes it very hard to trust other people and make relationships as an adult.